You're sitting at dinner with someone you've known for years. They're telling a story you've heard before, laughing at their own joke, and somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, you realize you feel absolutely nothing. No warmth, no connection, no anger even. Just this flat, clear awareness that the person across from you has been taking up space in your life that stopped belonging to them a long time ago. And the strangest part is, you're not sad about it. You're just done. That moment, that quiet, almost eerie clarity about who belongs in your life and who doesn't, is something Carl Jung studied extensively throughout his career. He noticed that as people matured psychologically, especially those doing the real internal work of becoming themselves, their tolerance for certain kinds of people didn't just decrease, it evaporated. Like a faculty they'd been born with had simply switched off. Jung saw this pattern repeat across hundreds of patients. Somewhere in the process of individuation, his term for the long, often painful journey of becoming who you actually are, people started shedding relationships the way trees shed leaves in autumn, naturally, without drama in many cases. The connections just dried up from the inside, and one day the person looked around and realized half the chairs at their table were empty, and for the first time, the empty chairs felt like relief instead of loss. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 5 specific types of people that Jung's framework helps us understand. The ones you naturally, almost inevitably stop tolerating as you grow older and more psychologically honest. I'll show you why each type becomes unbearable, what's actually happening in your psyche when you pull away from them, and why the guilt you might feel about outgrowing these people is one of the last chains keeping you tied to a version of yourself that's already gone. Because here's what nobody tells you about getting older. The loneliness of a smaller circle hurts less than the exhaustion of a crowded one full of people you've been pretending to enjoy. Jung spent decades watching what happened when people started the slow, often grueling process of dropping their masks. He called the mask the persona, the socially acceptable version of yourself that you've been performing since childhood. The agreeable one, the accommodating one, the one who laughs at jokes that aren't funny and shows up to gatherings that drain them and maintains friendships that run entirely on obligation and history. As the persona weakens, as you stop being willing or able to keep performing, certain relationships reveal themselves for what they always were: transactions, power dynamics, one-sided arrangements that only worked because you were willing to carry more than your share. And the moment you put that weight down, the people who benefited from you carrying it get very, very uncomfortable. Jung recognized that this discomfort, theirs and yours, was a sign of psychological progress. Your tolerance for inauthenticity was dropping because your own authenticity was rising. You weren't becoming cruel or selfish or antisocial. You were becoming honest. And honesty, it turns out, is the most efficient filter for human relationships ever invented. Let's talk about who gets filtered out. The first type of person you stop tolerating is the one who treats your boundaries like suggestions. You know this person. You've known them for years, probably. They show up unannounced. They ask questions that are too personal and then act hurt when you don't answer. They borrow things without asking. They make plans that assume your availability. They take liberties with your time, your space, your emotional energy. And when you finally say something about it, they look at you like you've lost your mind, like you're the one being unreasonable, like the problem is that you suddenly have limits, not that they've been ignoring limits your entire life. When you're young, you absorb this kind of behavior. You tell yourself they don't mean anything by it. You tell yourself you're being too sensitive, too rigid, too difficult. You accommodate because the cost of confrontation feels higher than the cost of compliance. And so you keep adjusting. You keep making yourself smaller so they can keep taking up more room. Jung would have recognized this dynamic immediately. He understood that the inability to hold boundaries often traces back to childhood, to environments where the child's autonomy was treated as an inconvenience. If you grew up in a household where your feelings were dismissed, where your needs were secondary, where the adults in your life moved through your emotional space like they owned it, then you were trained to experience boundary violations as normal. You don't even register them as violations. They just feel like how relationships work. But as you individuate, As the persona starts cracking and the real you starts surfacing, something shifts. The boundary violations that used to slide past your awareness start registering. You feel them now, like a sunburn that makes even gentle touch painful. Someone reaches into your personal life uninvited and you flinch. Someone assumes your time is theirs and something in your chest tightens. The tolerance didn't just lower, the numbness wore off. You're finally feeling what was always there, and the person who's been crossing your boundaries for years, they experience your new awareness as aggression. They say you've changed. They say you're cold. They tell mutual friends they don't know what happened to you, because in their mind, the version of you that let them do whatever they wanted was the real you. This version, the one with limits, with a voice, with a locked door, is a stranger they don't like very much. Jung wrote about how individuation almost always involves this kind of relational rupture. The people who built their connection with your persona, with the accommodating, boundaryless version, can't relate to the person emerging underneath, and you grieve that, sometimes deeply. But you also discover something you didn't expect, the relief of a room you don't have to guard, because everyone in it already respects the walls. The second type of person you stop tolerating is the one who only appears when they need something from you. Think about someone specific. I'll bet you can picture them right now. Their name, their face, the particular way your phone lights up and your stomach drops because you already know what the conversation is going to look like. They need to vent. They need advice. They need money. They need you to listen, to fix, to absorb, to carry. And you do it. You've always done it. Because you're the person people come to. That's been your role for so long that it's become part of your identity. The reliable one, the strong one, the one who always picks up. There's a certain pride in it, if you're honest, a certain sense of purpose. You matter because you're useful. You're loved because you're available. The equation is simple, and it's worked for decades, until it stops working, until you call them one day, you, the one who never asks for anything, and the line is silent. Or they pick up and you can hear the distraction in their voice, or they give you 5 minutes of half-hearted listening before steering the conversation back to themselves, and you hang up and sit there in the quiet of your own kitchen, and the truth lands on you with the weight of every unanswered text, every one-sided conversation, every time you showed up and they didn't. The relationship was never mutual. It was a supply chain, and you were the supply. Jung had a framework for understanding why people end up in these arrangements, and it cuts deeper than most people want to go. He connected compulsive helping to what he called shadow material, the parts of yourself you can't accept. If you grew up believing your worth was conditional, that you had to earn love through usefulness, then being needed feels like being valued. The person who only calls when they need something isn't exploiting a weakness you don't know about. They're exploiting a wound you've been carrying since before you can remember. As you mature psychologically, the wound starts to heal. Slowly, unevenly, with setbacks. But the healing changes the math. You start recognizing the difference between genuine connection and emotional extraction. You start noticing who calls to check on you and who calls to dump on you. You start paying attention to whether a relationship nourishes you or just depletes you more efficiently than being alone does. And the person who only showed up when they needed something, they feel the shift immediately. Because you've stopped responding with the same desperate eagerness, you've stopped clearing your schedule for their crisis, you've started letting calls go to voicemail, and the silence that follows tells you everything you need to know about what the relationship was built on. They don't chase you. They don't ask what's wrong. They just find someone else to call. And that, painful as it is the clearest answer you've ever received about what you meant to them. Jung would say this loss, and it is a loss, there's no dressing it up, is a necessary one. The table you've been sitting at had a chair reserved for someone who was never going to feed you. Removing that chair hurts, but it also makes room. The third type is the one who lives inside a performance and who needs you to applaud. Every room has this person. They're charming, they're impressive. They know exactly how to work a conversation so that by the end of it, you've learned everything about their accomplishments and nothing about their interior life. They curate every interaction. Every story they tell has been shaped and polished until it serves the image they're building, and they are building constantly, with a kind of frantic energy that's exhausting to be near for long periods, even if you can't articulate why. When you're younger, performers are magnetic. They fill the room with energy. They make things happen. They're fun, or at least they're entertaining, and the distinction between those two things doesn't register until later. You enjoy their company because they're putting on a show, and shows are enjoyable. That's the whole point of a show. But as you get older, as your own persona loosens and you start to value authenticity more than presentation, something changes in how you experience these people. The performance starts to feel claustrophobic. You're sitting across from someone and you can sense, almost physically, the wall between you. The person they're showing you and the person they actually are, and you can't reach through the glass no matter what you do. Every conversation stays on the surface because the surface is all they're willing to offer. Every vulnerable moment gets redirected into a joke or a deflection. You ask how they're really doing and they give you a highlight reel. Jung spent much of his career writing about the persona and the danger of over-identifying with it. He understood that some people fuse so completely with their social mask that they lose access to whatever exists beneath it. The mask becomes the face. The performance becomes the person. And what's left is someone who can charm a room full of strangers, but can't sit in silence with a single friend without reaching for their phone. What happens as you individuate is that proximity to performance starts to feel physically uncomfortable. Your system has recalibrated. You've been doing the hard, unglamorous work of facing what's underneath your own mask. The fear, the shame, the parts you spent years hiding. And you've discovered that real connection only happens below the surface. Two people, both willing to be seen as they actually are. No curation, no polish, just the raw, imperfect, sometimes awkward truth of who they are when nobody's watching. And once you've tasted that kind of connection, the performed kind starts to feel like eating plastic fruit. It looks real from a distance, but there's nothing there. You don't usually have a dramatic falling out with the performer. That's what makes this one tricky. They haven't done anything wrong exactly. They're pleasant, they're entertaining. They'd probably be there if you needed them on some functional level. But the gap between who they're showing you and who they are has become something you can't ignore. And being around it reminds you of all the years you spent performing too, and how hollow that felt, and how much it cost you. So you drift. You stop initiating. You respond slower. And eventually the chair at the table that had their name on it just sits empty, and you notice you don't miss the person who sat there. You miss the version of them you kept hoping would show up. If you're in this process right now, noticing how many of your relationships were built on performance, watching certain people fade from your life as your tolerance for surface-level connection drops, you're experiencing something Jung considered essential to the second half of life. That quiet reshuffling of who gets access to you. We put together 24 reflection exercises in a guide called True Self-Discovery, rooted in Jung's work on exactly this kind of psychological recalibration. If you're trying to make sense of what you're outgrowing and why, it might meet you right where you are. The link's below. The fourth type of person you stop tolerating is the scorekeeper. This one is subtle, and it can take years to see clearly because scorekeepers often disguise their behavior as generosity. They do things for you. They give gifts. They offer help. They show up in big ways during hard times. And from the outside, from any reasonable distance, they look like wonderful people, giving, caring, attentive. But there's a ledger. You can't see it, but it's there, and every act of generosity gets recorded on it. Every favor gets filed. Every time they showed up for you gets logged in a column that, sooner or later, will be presented to you as evidence of what you owe. You feel this before you understand it. There's a weight to their kindness that genuine kindness doesn't carry. When someone gives freely, there's a lightness to it. When someone gives with expectation, you can feel the string attached even when you can't see it. You feel indebted in a way that doesn't match the situation. You feel like you can never quite do enough, be enough, reciprocate enough. And if you ever fail to meet the invisible standard, if you don't respond to their generosity with the exact right amount of gratitude and counter-generosity, the ledger comes out. After everything I've done for you. That's the sentence. That's always the sentence, or some version of it. And it reframes every kind thing they ever did as a transaction you failed to honor. Every dinner they bought, every time they drove across town, every favor they did that you thought was given freely turns out to have had a price tag you didn't know about. Jung would have understood this dynamic in terms of the shadow's relationship to generosity. Genuine giving, the kind that flows from psychological wholeness, doesn't need reciprocation to feel complete. The act itself is fulfilling. But giving that originates from the shadow, from a need to control, to create obligation, to ensure that others can't leave because they owe too much, is a form of manipulation wearing the face of love. The scorekeeper often doesn't know they're keeping score. That's what makes this so painful and so complicated. They genuinely believe they're generous. They genuinely feel hurt when the generosity isn't matched. From inside their own experience, they're the giving one and you're the ungrateful one. Their shadow is invisible to them, which means the dynamic is invisible to them, which means any attempt to name it gets met with genuine bewilderment and outrage. As you get older, you develop a kind of radar for this energy. You can feel the difference between someone offering help because they want to and someone offering help because they're making a deposit they intend to withdraw later. The distinction is almost impossible to articulate. It's not in the words, it's in the weight of the gesture. But once you've been burned by the ledger enough times, you start trusting your gut about it, and you pull back, slowly. You stop accepting favors that feel heavy. You stop engaging in the reciprocity dance that the scorekeeper requires. And when the ledger eventually comes out, when they finally say, "After everything I've done," you recognize it for what it is. A bill for services you never agreed to purchase, and you can set it down. Jung wrote about how certain relationships operate as unconscious contracts, agreements that were never spoken aloud, but that both parties are expected to honor. The scorekeeper's contract says, "I give to you, and in exchange, you owe me loyalty, gratitude, and compliance." Breaking this contract is one of the more guilt-inducing things you'll do as you get older, because the scorekeeper's pain is real. Their hurt is genuine. They truly feel betrayed. But the contract was never fair, and you're no longer willing to live under terms you didn't agree to. The fifth type of person you stop tolerating, and this is the one that'll cost you the most, so take a breath, is the one who needs you to stay exactly who you've always been. This person might love you, genuinely. They might have your best interests at heart, or at least what they believe your best interests to be. They're not malicious. They're not scheming. They're just terrified of what happens if you change, because your change implies that change is possible. And if change is possible, then they have to look at their own life and ask whether they should be changing too. And that question is one they'd rather die than face. So they resist your growth, quietly, constantly, with 1,000 small gestures that are easy to miss and hard to name. They bring up the old you. They reference who you used to be like it was better, more fun, more real. They express concern that you're not yourself lately. They frame your evolution as a phase, a crisis, something you'll get over once you come back to your senses. You start eating differently and they make comments about it at every meal. You set a boundary and they tell you you've become difficult. You leave a relationship that was destroying you and they suggest you were hasty, that you should have tried harder, that you'll regret it. You start therapy and they ask why you need to dig up the past. You pursue something that excites you and they remind you of all the ways it could fail. Each comment on its own is nothing, a pebble. But the pile gets heavy, and one morning you realize you've been carrying 100 pounds of someone else's fear disguised as concern, and the weight has been slowing you down for years. Jung understood this dynamic deeply because he experienced it himself. When he broke from Freud, when his own individuation demanded that he stop performing the role of loyal disciple and start becoming his own thinker, the response from his professional and personal circles was swift and brutal. He was pathologized, dismissed, cast out. The people who needed him to stay the Jung they knew couldn't accommodate the Jung he was becoming. And the cost of their inability to accommodate him was isolation so severe that he questioned whether he'd survive it. He did survive it, and what he built on the other side of that isolation, his most important work, his deepest insights, the framework that's helped millions of people understand their own psyches, could only have been built by someone who was willing to lose the people who needed him to stay small. That's the trade. Jung never pretended it wasn't brutal. The person who needs you to stay the same often loves you, or some version of you anyway. And when you change, when you grow past the version they're comfortable with, their love doesn't stretch, it snaps. And you're left standing in the rubble of a relationship that might have been the most important one in your life, holding the terrible knowledge that you couldn't keep it and keep becoming yourself at the same time. This is the one that makes people stop individuating. The other four types, the boundary crosser, the extractor, the performer, the scorekeeper, those people are easier to release because there's something clearly dysfunctional about the dynamic. But the person who needs you to stay small might be your mother, your oldest friend, your spouse, the person who's been beside you through everything. And releasing them, or releasing the version of the relationship that requires your stagnation, feels like amputating a limb. Jung would tell you to do it anyway. He wouldn't be gentle about it either. He believed that the cost of abandoning your own individuation to preserve someone else's comfort was a kind of psychological suicide, a slow one, the kind that doesn't leave visible marks, but that kills the most essential part of you as thoroughly as any physical death could. He watched patients choose comfort over growth, over and over. He watched them return to the relationships that needed them small, watched them put the persona back on, watched the light that had started to emerge behind their eyes dim again as they settled back into the familiar shape. And he described it as one of the most painful things he'd ever witnessed. The voluntary return to the cage by someone who'd already tasted what it felt like to stand outside it. If you're at this particular crossroads, if you can feel yourself growing past someone and the guilt is eating you alive, sit with this. Your growth is not an act of cruelty toward the people who love the old you. Your growth is the single most honest thing you can do with the life you've been given. And the people who truly love you, the ones whose love is rooted in who you are rather than who they need you to be, will find a way to love the version that's emerging. The ones who can't weren't loving you. They were loving your compliance. And compliance dressed up as love is a prison that gets smaller every year you stay in it. There's a thread that runs through all five of these types, and Jung would want you to see it clearly. The boundary crosser, the extractor, the performer, the scorekeeper, the one who needs you small. They all have something in common. They all require you to abandon some part of yourself in order to maintain the relationship. They need your silence, your availability, your applause, your debt, your stagnation. They need you to be less than you are so the dynamic can continue functioning. And when you were younger, when the persona was intact, when your sense of self was still built on external validation, when belonging felt more important than authenticity, you paid that price willingly. You gave away pieces of yourself like they were infinite. You thought the cost of staying was smaller than the cost of leaving. And for a while, maybe it was. But time does something that no amount of therapy or self-help can replicate. It accumulates evidence. Year after year, the ledger of what you've given away gets longer, and the returns get thinner. And one day you do the math and realize you've been operating at a loss for decades. The relationships that were supposed to sustain you have been draining you. The people who were supposed to know you have only ever known the performance. And the version of yourself that accommodated all of this is exhausted in a way that sleep can't fix. That exhaustion is where the change comes from. Jung didn't romanticize this process. He didn't dress it up as enlightenment or evolution or any of the words that make painful things sound beautiful. He called it what it was, a reckoning, a psychological reckoning with the gap between who you've been living as and who you actually are. And he observed that this reckoning, while devastating, was the only reliable path to what he called the second half of life, the part where you stop building a life based on what's expected and start building one based on what's true. The table gets smaller. That's the reality. As you grow older and more honest, as the persona loosens and your tolerance for inauthenticity drops, the number of people who can sit comfortably at your table shrinks. And this is where the grief lives, in the shrinking, in the quiet recognition that some of the people you loved most couldn't survive the real you, that the relationships you thought were bedrock turned out to be built on the sand of your willingness to perform. But here's what Jung kept seeing in the patients who made it through this process, the ones who tolerated the smaller table instead of frantically filling it with new versions of the same old dynamics. The connections that remained were different in kind, not just in number, deeper, more nourishing, more honest. The people who stayed, or the new ones who arrived, drawn to the authentic version rather than the performed one, could handle your whole self, the messy parts, the difficult parts, the parts the old circle needed you to hide. And sitting at a table with 3 people who actually see you turns out to be worth more than sitting at a table with 30 people who only ever saw the mask. Jung described individuation as a narrowing that leads to an expansion. Your world gets smaller before it gets bigger. Your circle contracts before it deepens. You lose quantity and gain something that has no name, but that you recognize instantly when you feel it. The sensation of being known. Actually known. By people who chose you on purpose, knowing exactly who they were choosing. So if you're looking around your life right now and realizing that certain people have started to feel unbearable, if you're noticing that your patience for old dynamics has worn to nothing, that the relationships you used to maintain without thinking now require an effort you can no longer justify, you're not becoming cold. You're not becoming selfish. You're becoming yourself. And the self has standards the persona never did. Jung would tell you to trust this process even when it terrifies you. Even when the guilt says you're a terrible person for outgrowing people who love you. Even when the loneliness of the smaller table hits you at 2 in the morning and you wonder if you've made a catastrophic mistake. The guilt is the old programming, the childhood training that said your worth was measured by how much you could tolerate, how much you could carry, how many people you could keep comfortable at your own expense. That programming is breaking. Let it break. The people who belong at your table will find their way there, and they'll sit down and look at you, the real you, the one without the mask, the one who stopped performing years ago, and they'll stay. They'll stay because they came for you, the actual you, the difficult, honest, boundary-having, growth-demanding, fully alive you. That's who Jung spent his life trying to help people become. Someone who could sit at their own table and feel, for the first time, like they actually belonged there. The chairs might be fewer, but every single one of them is occupied by someone who earned their seat. And the empty chairs? They're just proof that you finally stopped giving away space you needed for yourself. If you haven't yet, we built a guide for exactly this season of life, the season where everything you've been tolerating becomes intolerable, and you need a framework for understanding why. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed to help you find your way within the changes that are already happening. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.